It happened just before noon in Rome on a Monday in late May, when the bells of St. Peter still hung in the warm air. A document was placed into the hands of the world. It carried the seal of the Pope, and inside it was a sentence that no man in white had ever spoken aloud in 500 years. For half a millennium, every pope who sat on the throne of Peter knew the secret. They knew it the way a family knows the thing it never says at the dinner table. They walked past it in the archives. They felt its shadow in the marble, and one after another for 20 generations, they chose silence. Then a man from Chicago, the son of a Creole family from the back streets of New Orleans, picked up his pen, and he wrote the words the Vatican had buried since before Columbus ever crossed the sea. He did not whisper it, he confessed it. In the name of the Church. Before we go further into this, take a moment to subscribe and leave a comment telling me where in the world you are watching from tonight. There are souls listening to this story from places you would not believe, and it matters that we are here together. Now let us return to Rome and to the wound that was finally opened. To understand what Pope Leo XIV did, you must travel back, far back, to a century the world barely remembers. The year is 1452. Constantinople has not yet fallen. The printing press does not yet exist. And in the city of Rome sits a quiet, scholarly pope named Nicholas V, a lover of books, the founder of the Vatican Library, a man history would remember as gentle. On the 18th day of June, in that year, this gentle pope put his hand to a document called Dum Diversas. The Latin words mean simply until different times, but the content was anything but gentle. In that bull, Nicholas V granted to King Afonso of Portugal a terrible permission. He authorized the king to attack, to conquer, and to subdue the enemies of Christ wherever they were found. And then came the phrase that would echo in chains across 4 continents. He granted the king the right to reduce the Saracens, the pagans, and other unbelievers to perpetual servitude, slavery without end. Slavery passed down to children and to their children forever. It was not a private letter, it was a papal bull, the highest and most binding form of teaching a pope can issue. It carried the full weight of Rome, and it did not stop there. 3 years later, on the 8th of January, 1455, the same pope went further. He issued a second bull, Romanis Pontifex. This time he confirmed and expanded what he had begun. He granted Portugal the exclusive right to explore, to trade, and to seize the coast of Africa. He gave the crown of Portugal what its kings would treat as moral permission to take human beings by force or by purchase along the entire western shore of a continent. The enslavement of the south of a desert cape was no longer a crime in the eyes of the men who claimed to speak for God. It was now, in their minds, blessed. Think on that. The very office that would one day canonize saints who freed slaves had, in its own hand, opened the gate. These 2 documents, Dum Diversas and Romanus Pontifex, became the legal and spiritual foundation of the Atlantic slave trade. Historians do not dispute this. Kings and merchants pointed to them for centuries as their justification. When a Portuguese captain dragged a man in irons onto a ship, the paper that made it lawful in the courts of Europe traced its authority back to Rome, back to a pope, back to a bull sealed in the Vatican. From these bulls grew something even larger, a way of seeing the world that scholars now call the doctrine of discovery. It was a simple, monstrous idea. It held that Christian kings had the right to claim any land that was not already ruled by Christians, and to do as they wished with the people they found there. That idea sailed west with the explorers. It crossed into the Americas. It was written into the laws of empires, and centuries later, even into the rulings of courts in the new nations of the world. A single decision made in a Roman study in the 15th century became the scaffolding on which whole continents were carved up and whole peoples were chained. And the numbers, when you let yourself feel them, are almost beyond bearing. Across the centuries that followed, more than 12 million African men, women, and children were forced onto ships and carried across the ocean. Nearly 2 million of them never reached the far shore. They died in the holds, in the dark, in the chains, and their bodies were thrown into the sea. Each one was a soul. Each one had a mother, a name, a god. And the trade that swallowed them had been told by the highest authority in Christendom that it need not fear for its conscience. And here is the part that wounds. For nearly 400 years after those pools were signed, no pope publicly took them back. No pope stood and said this was wrong. The slave ships crossed the ocean by the thousands. Whole nations were emptied of their sons and daughters. Generations were born into bondage, lived in bondage, and died in bondage. And from the chair of Peter on this matter, there came mostly silence. That silence is the secret. Not that the documents existed. Scholars always knew. The secret was the refusal to face it, the quiet decision, made by pope after pope, to let the past sleep undisturbed, to never say the words out loud. But silence is not the whole story, because the truth, when it is true, always survives. And in the long darkness, a light did finally come. His name was Gioacchino Pecci, and he took the name Leo XIII. He became Pope in 1878, an old man already, with sharp eyes and a sharper mind. The world was changing around him. Most of the nations of the West had already abolished slavery. And Leo XIII looked at the long shame of the centuries, and he decided he would not be silent. On the 5th of May, 1888, he issued an encyclical called In Plurimis. He addressed it to the bishops of Brazil, the very last nation in the Western world still holding human beings in chains. Within days, Brazil would pass its golden law and free its slaves at last. And Leo wanted it on the record, dated before the law was even signed, that the Pope had stood on the side of the enslaved. In that letter he wrote against slavery with a force no Pope before him had ever used. He called it contrary to the law of God and to the dignity of man. He reminded the world that every human soul is made in the image of the Creator, that liberty is a gift from God Himself, and that to chain a man is to insult the one who made him free. He praised the great Saint Peter Claver, the priest who had spent his life in the slave ports, baptizing and comforting the broken men who came off the ships. And what a life that was! Peter Claver was a Spaniard who crossed the ocean to the port of Cartagena in what is now Colombia in the early 1600s, when the slave ships still came thick and constant. He called himself the slave of the slaves forever. When a ship arrived, while others fled the stench and the disease, he went down into the holds with food, with medicine, with water, with his own 2 hands. He is said to have baptized hundreds of thousands of the captives over 40 years, kneeling in the filth to tend the dying. Leo held that saint up as the answer to the centuries of cruelty, a single man who had done with love what the institution had failed to do with its authority. And he did not stop there. 2 years later, in November of 1890, he wrote a second encyclical, Catholica Ecclesiae, this time to the missionaries of Africa. He called slavery a foul blot upon the human race and begged the faithful of the world to give of their own means to wipe it out. For the first time in its history, the institution that had once opened the gate now threw its full weight against the trade in human flesh. Leo XIII was the first pope to clearly and openly condemn slavery, the first in all those centuries. And yet even he, brave as he was, did something he did not fully do. He condemned the sin, but he did not name the wound at the heart of his own house. He did not stand and say that Rome itself, that the papacy itself, had once given the slavers their permission. That last and hardest confession he left undone. It would wait another 138 years. It would wait for a most unlikely man. Robert Francis Prevost was born in Chicago in the middle of the last century, the son of a quiet Catholic family. He was raised, by all accounts, as a white American boy in a working-class parish. He became a priest of the Augustinian order. He spent long years as a missionary in Peru among the poor, learning their language and their sorrows. Few outside the church had ever heard his name. Then, in the spring of last year, the cardinals locked themselves in the Sistine Chapel and the smoke turned white, and a man stepped onto the balcony over St. Peter's Square as the first pope ever born in the United States. He took the name Leo XIV, and that name was no accident. He chose it, he said, in deliberate memory of Leo XIII, the very pope who had broken the long silence on slavery and stood for the dignity of working men against the powers of his age. In choosing the name Leo, the new pope was reaching back across more than a century and taking up an unfinished work. He was telling the world before anyone understood why, exactly whose torch he meant to carry. And almost at once, the historians began to dig into his blood. What they found astonished even his own brothers, for the family of Pope Leo XIV, on his mother's side, came from the 7th Ward of New Orleans, the old Creole heart of that city. His grandparents, Joseph Martinez and Louise Baquier, were people of color, married in a Catholic church on Annette Street in the 1880s, who later boarded a train north to Chicago and quietly let the past fall away. The Pope's own family history, by the honest reckoning of those who studied it, contained both the enslaved and those who held others in bondage. Both the chain and the hand upon it ran in his veins. Here was a man who carried the whole wound of history inside his own body. A son of the very people the bulls of Nicholas V had condemned. A descendant on one side of those who were sold, and on another of those who sold them. If any man on earth was made to speak the words that had waited 500 years, it was this one. And on the 25th of May in this year of our Lord, he spoke them. He did it inside his very first encyclical, a long and sweeping letter called Magnifica Humanitas, which means magnificent humanity. An encyclical is the most solemn kind of letter a pope can write to the whole church. And the first one a pope issues sets the tone for everything that follows. The greater part of this one was about something startling and modern. It was a warning about how mankind must guard its own soul in this new age of thinking machines and artificial minds. An age when men are tempted to hand over to machines the very judgments that make us human. Leo asked how we can claim to protect human dignity in the future if we will not first be honest about how we trampled it in the past. And so, woven into that vision of tomorrow, Leo XIV turned and faced the past, the deepest part of the past, the part no pope had ever faced in public. He wrote of the early modern centuries, and he confessed the unspeakable thing in plain words. He wrote that the apostolic see of Rome, answering the request of kings, had intervened more than once to regulate and to legitimize forms of subjugation, and in certain cases, the enslavement of those they called infidels. Read that slowly. The Pope admitted that Rome itself, the Holy See, the very office he now held, had once given slavery its blessing. He did not blame distant kings alone. He did not hide behind the sins of merchants. He named the chair of Peter, his own chair. And then he wrote the sentence that will be remembered. He wrote that this constitutes a wound in Christian memory, one from which we cannot consider ourselves detached. A wound in Christian memory, not a regrettable footnote, not a misunderstanding of a darker age. A wound, a thing that still bleeds, a thing that belongs to all of us who carry the name of Christ, that we cannot wash our hands off, that we cannot pretend was somebody else's doing. He went further still. He acknowledged the delay, the terrible delay, with which both the world and the church came at last to denounce the scourge of slavery. And then, in the name of the whole church, he did the thing his predecessors would not do. He wrote that it is impossible not to feel deep sorrow when contemplating the immense suffering and the humiliation endured by so many, in such stark contrast to their measureless dignity as persons infinitely loved by the Lord. And for this, in the name of the church, he sincerely asked for pardon. He asked for pardon. The Pope, in the name of the church, for a sin sealed with the seal of Rome 5 centuries ago. Never in 500 years had it happened. Other popes had apologized for the sins of Christians, for the cruelty of individual believers across the ages. But no pope had ever stood and pointed at the institution itself, at the papal documents themselves, at the bulls of Nicholas V, and said, "This was ours, and we ask forgiveness." That is what wounded the Vatican. Not an attack from outside, a confession from within. The head of the church admitting that the church's own hand had once turned the key in the lock. You can imagine the stillness in those marble halls when the words went out. Some rejoiced. The descendants of the enslaved, the great lay societies named for that same St. Peter Claver, whom Leo XIII had praised, gave the Pope their full and grateful support. Others, no doubt, sat in silence of their own, troubled that the secret of centuries had been spoken at last and could never again be unspoken. So why does this matter to you tonight? Listening alone in the dark with this small light in your hand, it matters because it tells you something about the faith you have carried all your life. It tells you that the church is not what its enemies say, an empire that hides its sins forever behind gold and Latin. And it is not what some of its defenders pretend, a thing that never erred at all. It is something stranger and more human and more holy than either. It is a body of flawed and frightened men, carrying across the centuries a treasure they did not deserve, sometimes betraying it and sometimes by grace finding the courage to confess. The truth survived. That is the heart of it. For 500 years the wound was hidden, but it was never healed by hiding. It waited. It waited through 20 generations of silence. And it came out in the end, not from a critic, not from an enemy, but from the lips of a pope, a son of New Orleans, who carried the very history in his blood. The thing that was buried rose, the sealed room was opened, and the man chosen to open it was the most unlikely man of all. That is how God works in his church, slowly, through the long patience of centuries, through the one unlikely soul prepared without knowing it across the generations. The grandparents on Annette Street did not know they were preparing a pope to heal a wound 500 years old, but heaven knew. And perhaps that is the real message hidden inside this story for you. The scenes of your own life, the old wounds in your own family memory, the things hidden and never spoken, are not beyond the reach of grace either. If the chair of Peter can confess the darkest secret of 5 centuries and find mercy, then so can you. Nothing buried is beyond the light. Nothing. The bells of St. Peter's still ring over Rome tonight. The bulls of Nicholas V still rest in the archives, yellowed and old. But for the first time in 500 years, a pope has called them by their name and asked God to forgive. The wound is open at last, and only an open wound can ever truly heal. Stay close to the faith, keep the light burning, and do not be afraid of the truth, however long it has been hidden. Because in the end, the truth is the one thing that always, always comes home.